Fiona is the Australian Government's Threatened Species Commissioner. And we're really fortunate in having had previous Threatened Species Commissioner come to talk to the IRE. So she continues on a really nice tradition that we've had. And it's also really an opportune time to hear from Fiona, given the current changes that are underway in terms of conservation and management of biodiversity in Australia, with things like the biodiversity reforms and major initiatives that have just started up, like the Threatened Species Action Plan, which I think Fiona's going to tell us about. So join with me. Thank you, Fiona, for coming on today.
Thanks for the introduction. So I've got this turned on. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay, good. Thank you very much for the introduction, and wonderful to be here today in a long line of Threatened Species Commissioners who've popped across to the other side of the lake to chat to you all. So I'm Fiona Fraser, the Australian Government's Threatened Species Commissioner, and I'm going to cover a few different things today, with a focus on that Threatened Species Action Plan. But I also wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Canberra region, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and participants in the audience today, online and here, and the important role that they play and continue to play in the stewardship of our threatened plants and animals and Australia's environment. So the presentation today, I'll just check with you, Vicky, for next slide. Is this?
Yeah, you should be able to do that.
Oh. Not a day for tech, is it? No. No worries. Okay, so I wasn't, even though I'm here in the university, wasn't exactly sure how to pitch this one. I know there's some people in the audience and some lecturers who are species experts or experienced ecologists, but I am also assuming there's people who have limited experience in this space, or might be sort of have some passions and interests, but haven't got a great depth of experience. So I've tried to pitch it a little bit in between, but happy to take questions sort of at either end of the spectrum at the end. So what I was going to run through today was a sort of an overview of why Australia is an important and diverse country, and the state of our environment based on the recent publication of the State of the Environment report. I was going to again provide a bit of a high-level overview of the role of the Australian Government generally in threatened species recovery and conservation, and then drill down a bit more to the role of the Threatened Species Commissioner and my office, and then talk in a bit more detail about the Australian Government's Threatened Species Action Plan, which is one of our key policy documents to guide recovery nationally. And then at the end, I was going to talk a bit about evidence-based policy and how to influence evidence-based policy, both within the Australian Government, but more broadly. Okay, so we all know that Australia is a very special place, but what is it that makes the Australian environment so unique? So our biodiversity is globally significant. We're formally recognised as one of the 17 megadiverse countries around Australia. That means they're countries that only cover 10% of the land surface, but account for 70% of our species. Our ecosystems are globally distinct, ranging from alpine, temperate, rainforest, freshwater and arid regions. And it is unique. We've got species that are evolutionarily distinct, such as the Wallamai pine, a Gondwana relic. We have extremely high levels of endemism, so that's plants and animals which are only found here, they're not found anywhere else. So we're home to 85% of our plant species are endemic. We're also home to half of the world's marsupials. We also have some species like the critically endangered plains wanderer, one of my favourites in the corner here, which is the only species in its entire family. So whatever way you want to cut it, Australia is a very special place when it comes to biodiversity. Our wildlife is also central to the cultural identity of Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, who have shaped the landscapes of Australia and its biota, but also have a continuing and important stewardship role and management of these assets. Our biodiversity underpins our economy, our climate, our health, and our well-being. And indeed, it's a source of pride and wonder for many Australians, and I assume inspiration for many people here in the room today who are passionate about its conservation and its care. So, in July of last year, the 2021 State of the Environment report was announced published by the Australian Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek. The State of the Environment report is a comprehensive, evidence-based and independent assessment of the state of Australia's environment, all aspects of it. It's required to be produced every 5 years. It's a legislative requirement for the Australian government to produce that. And this report provides a strong message that Australia's environment needs our help. The environment is deteriorating and continuing to decline. It's certainly, this report, you would have to say, pulled no punches. So for many of us who work in biodiversity conservation, on the one hand, there were no surprises in that report because it is a synthesis of existing information, but it was also a very, very compelling and stark reminder of the state of the continuing decline of our environment. So I've got and it's a huge and comprehensive analysis, and I've just picked out a couple of key points here that relate to some of the presentation. So it reminded us that over 100 Australian plants and animals have gone extinct since colonisation, that there are over 1,900 plants and animals that are listed as threatened with extinction under our national environment law, and over 85 threatened ecological communities which are threatened with extinction. These, for those of you unfamiliar with threatened species listings and global listings, these are large numbers by any measure, and they continue to grow. So recent catastrophic events such as the Black Summer bushfires and the floods continue to add species to that list. Species which weren't formally threatened get added, and species which were already listed with threatened may become more threatened and uplisted under those lists. You can see from the map here, and there's no surprises there, where the density of those threatened species are, and it's where there's generally been a lot of development and land clearing around Australia since colonisation. The report also said that the extent and representativeness of our protected area system is increasing, but nowhere near enough, and that the environmental decline that we're experiencing affects people's well-being. So the authors stated that our health, our living standards, our cultural and spiritual fulfilment, connection to country are all interconnected and are negatively impacted by our deteriorating environment. This slide here brings out work of Stephen Kearney, who an ecologist who now works for Bush Heritage Australia, and it illustrates the number of Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, so nationally listed species, which are impacted by each of the major recognised threat categories. So you can see here that introduced species, both plants and animals, are the single most pervasive threat and a primary cause of species extinction. But it's really a close race with ecosystem modification and agriculture, essentially habitat destruction. But I guess the key thing I wanted to point out with this, with some of this information, is that for each of the listed species nationally, that each one is impacted on average by 4 of these significant threats, and that these threats interact with catastrophic results. For example, interactions between climate change, changing fire regimes, weed species coming into play can all interact to really result in drastic and transformative ecosystem change. Okay, so the State of the Environment report authors also found that some things are improving, and there are very good reasons for hope. So some of these are listed here. There's been improvements in our technology, our tools, and our knowledge to better understand the environment and to better manage it. There's been, we're increasingly recognising and embracing leadership from First Nations peoples as central to biodiversity management. This State of the Environment report was the first one where each chapter was co-authored by Indigenous authors. There's greater involvement of businesses and communities in delivering change on the ground, improvements on the ground for our environment. Our ex situ conservation has advanced. So there's now better representation, for example, of threatened mammal species in safe havens around the country. And the report authors also found that where we collectively focus our efforts to recover species threatened with extinction, we can deliver results. And the authors used the example of the first threatened species strategy, where we prioritised effort on a particular group of species as improving the trajectories of 24 of those species over that 5-year period. The authors stated that immediate action with innovative management and collaboration can turn things around. And it's very important for us to remain focused on the possibilities that come with that, because the challenges are enormous, but it is important to keep our eye on when we focus our attention, we really can make a difference. And I wanted to just give a couple of examples of species which were prioritised through the first threatened species strategy. So Sally and Gregory may have spoken about these when they presented in previous years, where focused effort did make a difference. So the first one is the central rock rat, this little fella here, which is restricted to the McDonnell Ranges in Central Australia. Its distribution and population has vastly diminished over the decades. More recently, it was ranked as the mammal taxon most likely to go extinct within 20 years. Focused efforts over that 5-year period have essentially averted the extinction of this mammal. So that has involved targeted and landscape scale baiting of feral cats, the key predator of the central rock rat, improvements in fire regimes and weed management. It's involved developing partnerships and working arrangements between the territory government, the NRM region in the Northern Territory, the Arenti traditional owners, and Aboriginal ranger groups in that area to partner to bring about this conservation effort. So the prospects for the central rock rat in the McDonnell Ranges have improved, but importantly, because there were more of them, we were able to individuals were able to be taken and translocated to a safe haven, which was developed by Australian Wildlife Conservancy, New Haven. It's a very large safe haven. And there's now been a population translocated to New Haven. This species is also successfully bred in captivity in the Northern Territory Desert Wildlife Park. So what this means is it's not just counting individuals, which matters here. What matters here is there are now the ability to breed in captivity, but also another population if there is a catastrophic event occurring in the McDonnell Ranges, which could threaten this species. And many of you will be aware there were indeed significant bushfires. In recent weeks, it got a lot of media attention, burning throughout the McDonnell Ranges, which did not actually impact that central rock rat, those populations there, but certainly could have. And we will anticipate there'll be many more bushfires like this in the McDonnell Ranges, particularly with the spread of buffel grass, which is introduced pasture grass, which leads to much hotter and regular fires in that region. The other species I wanted to mention as an example of where focused effort can improve prospects is the helmeted honeyeater, which is a critically endangered bird species found down it's a woodland bird species, mostly restricted to the Yellingbo Conservation Reserve in Victoria. So in 1989, a group of concerned citizens came together to form the Friends of the Helmeted Honeyeater group, which has just gone from strength to strength since then. At that point in time, I think there were probably only about 70 helmeted honeyeaters, which is a very, very, very small number of individuals. And this group has been instrumental in driving recovery efforts for this species and raising public awareness and advocating for better protection and resources for its management. It's extremely active and passionate group. And I noticed looking on their website recently, they've also got a youth reference group, which is fantastic and an opportunity for younger people to engage in that advocacy and on-ground recovery work. So over the many years that this group has been formed, it's helped in revegetating habitat within and around the Yellingbo Conservation Reserve. And it's also established a nursery way back in the 1990s, which now sort of supports around close to 100,000 plants a year to be sort of used generally in that region for revegetation. They've led on developing captive breeding program for this bird, for on-ground restoration and protection activities, for land purchases, for nest protection, for better conservation on private properties in the region, for deer control. I've got a longer list here, you name it. This group has really agitated for and been behind and led a lot of these on-ground activities, which you can see each one on their own is an enormous undertaking, and then to do that in a sort of consolidated way is very impressive. So these birds are by no means out of the woods. You can see here between 2015 and 2020, their population doubled. It is still only about 250 birds, which is an extremely small population, but that is an improvement on going backwards or being stable. So the Friends of Group have been, I guess, the driving force and instrumental in that success. And so that leads me to the next slide, which is, I guess, so the central rock rat and the hee-ho are just a couple of examples of where this focused effort has made a difference. And you can see even from those very quick examples that threatened species recovery is a very complex business. It's a long-term business and it's enormous and costly job. But advances in our knowledge on how to do this and the tools available to us to achieve these conservation outcomes are growing all the time. So I've just got a picture here of the Book of Hope, which some of you will be familiar with. It was authored by Stephen Garnett and many other threatened species experts. And that book provides a compelling case for the potential for conservation success. It makes clear that threatened species recovery is achievable and that many in the community are devoted to this objective. It also identifies what I call the key ingredients for success for threatened species recovery, and I've listed them here. So you need good planning, it needs to be strategic, it needs to be well informed. You need strong partnerships, that the right people at the planning stage and the right people at the implementation stage. And also for many of our success stories in threatened species recovery, not all of them, but a lot of them, there's actually a champion, an individual or two who have seen the course and who have been passionate and been behind much of that conservation action. You need good policy and you need robust legislation to continue to protect habitat and other threats to that species. You need resources and you need truckloads of it. Each of these different activities that is required on their own are very costly. You need science to be able to inform the work that's taking place. And to be able to do that in an adaptive way. Many of these projects are very long term, and so to adapt as further information comes to light, particularly as we have huge knowledge gaps on many of our threatened species. And finally, one of their key ingredients of success is to tell that story. And that means to communicate the challenges, the knowledge gaps, but also to raise awareness and to share stories of success. And I think that full cycle of communication is very important in advancing across the board our threatened species recovery efforts. I've got a picture here. You'll think it's a bit weird of me baking in the kitchen, but it's just a segue to one of my office's key awareness raising events every year is a threatened species bake-off, which has a focus on reaching a much broader audience than just the conservation sector and is very successful in doing that. But it's also an opportunity for people who are committed to work in this space to be able to share some of the cool things they're doing and also to raise awareness about some of the key threats to these species as well. Okay, so I'd like to switch now to just cover at a fairly high level the role of the Australian government in threatened species conservation and my role and the role of my office in recovery initiatives. So a key role of the Australian government in biodiversity conservation and threatened species recovery is to regulate activities under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act to protect threatened species, threatened ecological communities, and other matters of national environmental significance. So that includes Ramsar wetlands and World Heritage areas. As you'll be aware, the Australian government is currently pursuing significant reforms in this area. So the EPBC Act was reviewed by Graham Samuels. He's put down recommendations. The Australian government is implementing those recommendations and towards that released the Nature Positive Plan late last year. So that is a key focus of reforms under the Australian government. We're anticipating legislation under this to be going before the Parliament before the end of this year, 2023. So these legal protections for our threatened species are critically important to both prevent extinctions into the future and to underpin the recovery of many of these species. But the perilous state of many of our threatened plants and animals means that simply, and it's not simple, having the strong legal protections in place is not enough. We also need to be pursuing proactive recovery actions for many of these species, particularly those which are on the brink of extinction. So the Australian government also, towards this, provides national leadership on policy and approach to doing this. We have flagship programs which have supported and continue to support some of these efforts. So that includes the Natural Heritage Trust, which some of you will have been engaged with, which has been a decade-long program. And then new flagship threatened species initiatives such as the Saving Native Species program, which was an election commitment of the current government. It's starting to roll out now, and we're also designing other elements of that. So watch that space for more grant opportunities under that. Another key role of the Australian government is research to inform environmental protection and recovery, including for threatened species and ecological communities. So within our department, the flagship program is the National Environmental Science Program, which again, academics from UC have been involved with over time. And we're currently working closely with all of the hubs under that program at the moment to ensure that their research is applied and is going to be able to be taken up by organisations like ours, but others who are active in that space at the moment. Australian government has an important role in management of our Commonwealth terrestrial and marine and co-managed parks, but also in through the Department of Defence, through the management of the Defence Estate, which is, there's actually thousands of properties around the hundreds or thousands, I'm not sure, at least hundreds around the country. Many of them are quite large and many of them have high biodiversity values as well. And finally, and this is a very important one, we are part of a federated system. So the work that we do with the states and territories have an extremely important and powerful roles when it comes to environmental management and threatened species. And so the protection and recovery of these nationally listed species and ecological communities requires close collaboration across governments, but also engagement of other sectors and the community. Okay, so what is the role of my office within this context? So I'm the Australian Government's third Threatened Species Commissioner. I'm part of the Australian Government Public Service, but with a unique remit to bring a focus and raise awareness of the plight of threatened species. I've got a small but passionate office, and I've got Giles from my team here today, and thank you for help with the presentation, Giles. And as a team, we work together to bringing together science, action and partnership where we feel that we can make the most difference to bring about the recovery of threatened species. As I mentioned, a key part of our office is in awareness raising. So we have a fairly healthy social media following, and we use that to get messages out to the public to raise awareness about issues, but also to celebrate recovery efforts as well. And you'll see if you're following me on social media, there's a mix of raising awareness about threats and action that needs to happen, but also celebrating a lot of the work that practitioners, researchers and community groups are doing every day in this space. So, but I guess a big part of our work is in developing and implementing the Australian Government's Threatened Species Action Plan, which prioritises species, places, threats and actions over the coming 5 to 10 years. So this is the Australian Government's new Threatened Species Action Plan. It was launched by the Environment Minister in October of last year. It prioritises 110 species, 20 places, and various threats and other actions around the country. And it is the document which will guide Australian government investments and also applied science through the Australian government over coming years. There's a fair bit to it, and I don't intend in this presentation on going through all aspects of it, but I did want to cover at a high level what the structure was, and then to explore some of the 10-year objectives in a little more detail. So structurally, the action plan has 4 10-year overarching objectives, the headline one being no new extinctions. And the next one being to protect and conserve 30% of Australia's landmass. It also aims to put the 110 priority species on a better trajectory over that 10-year period and to improve the condition of the 20 priority places over that 10-year period. There's 22 measurable targets which underpin those 10-year objectives, and those targets need to be achieved in a 5-year period. Those targets are what I would call both direct targets. Many of them are outcomes-based targets, such as improving species trajectories, or the other example is conserving 80% of listed plants in seed banks. And then a series of foundational targets, so targets that will provide a foundation or support those direct targets. They include, there's several of them, but increased First Nations-led projects, development and publication of monitoring standards, and related targets. Each of those targets have a series of actions over particular periods of time for both the department but other partners to be implementing so that we're advancing towards those targets. We've committed to reporting, so we'll do a sort of comprehensive report up to the period of 2025 on implementation, but we'll do a halfway report on progress for the period up to 2027. Okay, so to step through the 10-year objectives of the action plan, I'm not going to go into them in a whole lot of detail, but the first one is to prevent new extinctions. And this objective is really about drawing a line in the sand for species which are known to be extant, and to preventing future species falling off the edge, basically. And I cannot overstate how hugely ambitious this target is. It will need a superhuman effort for us to achieve it. But given the perilous state of our environment and of many of our plants and animals, it is exactly this level of ambition which is required if we're to make progress. So me and my team are in the process of developing guidance and a decision framework, which is going to allow us to identify the species that are high risk of imminent extinction. Of course, there's close to 2,000 threatened species and ecological communities, and this is really about, and which are all threatened with extinction, but this is really about a focus on those which are perilously close to the edge, whether that be due to a recent catastrophic event or another unforeseen circumstance. The idea with this framework that we're developing and a program to support that is that we will be in a position and working with our state agencies as well to be in a position to be responsive and to implement urgent management attention for these species. This particular objective also aligns with the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's Global Biodiversity Framework, which many of you will be familiar with, was agreed last year, which also includes a goal around preventing new extinctions. The wording's slightly different, but it's essentially the same objective. And importantly, the first meeting of environment ministers under this new Australian government, which took place in October last year, Minister Plibersek took to that meeting this goal, and environment ministers agreed collectively to work towards this goal of preventing new extinctions, which illustrates the ability of the action plan to influence and drive change, noting the importance of that collective action across states and territories and the Commonwealth government. Okay, the second objective is to protect and conserve 30% of Australia's landmass over a 10-year period. Again, this objective lines up with the commitment in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a broader commitment globally to protect and conserve 30% of land and sea. Australia currently has about 45% of our marine areas under some sort of protection and 22% of our landmass under protection. So it looks like we've got probably more work to do in the marine space when you think about the types of protection there. Well advanced on the land target on one respect. In the other respect, that 8% is hugely ambitious. It's around 60 million hectares, I think, or more. And if you think of Victoria as a 23 million hectare state, that's a large area of land to be recognised as contributing to conservation to bring online over that period of time. There's a lot of Indigenous protected areas which are likely to be declared over that period of time, which will make a substantial contribution to this global and domestic target. But the Australian government is also considering, to meet this target, we are also going to need to consider other effective area-based conservation measures, affectionately known as OECMs, by people working in that space. And so the recognition of these other effective area-based, I always get it wrong, sorry, I've written it down, other effective area-based conservation measures, I don't know who came up with that one, it could have been simpler, couldn't it? Is an opportunity to give greater recognition to areas that have been that are important for biodiversity, but where formal designation as protected area is not desirable or is not achievable into the longer term, and to recognise conservation efforts in some of these areas where the land may be managed for other purposes, but is making an ongoing contribution to conservation. So again, Environment Ministers agreed to develop a framework to recognise OECMs when they met in October of last year. So important having that sort of collective approach to this. There's a consultation paper out right now, put out by colleagues in my department, seeking input on the principles which are underpinning the OECM framework, and there'll be further consultation on the sort of the detail that will underpin that over time. So those principles are things like it needs to have, you know, high biodiversity values. There needs to be consent in what occurs. It needs to be sustainable into the longer term. So if you haven't already and you're interested in that space, opportunity to influence that policy closing today, I think, or about today. Okay, so the next 10-level objective I wanted to talk about was the objective to put the 110 priority species on a better trajectory over the next 10 years. So you don't need to read all of these. This is, and you can see it in the actual plan. This is the list of the 110 species which were prioritised out of the 1,800 plus species which are listed under the Act. 22 birds, 21 mammals, 9 fish, 11 invertebrates, 11 reptiles, 6 frogs, 30 plants. If any of you are species or taxonomic experts, you're going to be disappointed in how many of your particular area of interest or love is represented here. That is the case when we're only capturing 5% of the full list of threatened species there. What we've tried to do with the animals, the sort of proportional representation here is roughly, but not perfectly, aligned with representation of listings of those taxonomic groups under the Act at the moment. Plants actually constitute about 2/3 of listed species under the Act, so they're one respect underrepresented here, but we've also worked to get quite different types of plants and good geographic representation of those plants. So I wanted to just step through a little bit how we came to that list of 110 priority species. So to start with, we worked with quite a few scientists, but also did a fairly extensive public consultation to come up with 6 principles to help prioritise that work. So those principles include risk of extinction. So those 110 species are not just the most threatened species on the list of 1,800. It is just one factor that was considered. Some of those species are critically endangered. Some of them are considered vulnerable, which is a lower level of threat for threatened species. We considered multiple benefits. So where action to support one species might have co-benefits for other species which inhabit the same habitat. We considered feasibility and effectiveness. We considered importance to people and uniqueness, and we also aimed for representativeness across different around Australia, essentially, lands and waters. So we had a period of consultation to develop those principles. We then ran a structured elicitation process, working with some independent researchers, Libby Rumpf from University of Melbourne, who's now in my team, and Stephen Kearney, who I mentioned earlier, who did that threat analysis, who now works for Bush Heritage. The species were scored against, each of the 1,800 species were scored against these principles using national scale data sets, as well as input from the Australian community on the importance to people aspect. And then in order to come up with that list, we then did some work in-house where for example, we ended up even using that framework with a lot of plants being identified in the Stirling Ranges in southwest Western Australia, which of course makes sense. But we decided to spread some of the love for plants to other areas. So went down the list to bring other species up so that we weren't having bunches of species sort of in particular areas. So that was part of the achieving sort of geographic spread and representation and across different biomes around Australia as well. What this map shows here is it's the combined distributions of the known or likely distribution of those species, so the more conservative mapping of their distribution under the EPBC Act of the 110 species. So you can see it's not 100% coverage of the Australian landmass or seas, but it's actually not bad when you consider they're 5% of the whole list. So what that will mean for some species is that on-ground efforts to support habitat improvements or address threats will also have spin-off benefits for other species which cohabit in that space. So if we take Western ground parrot, you can't see where I'm pointing, but down in the southwest of Western Australia, in situ efforts to support that species, such as fire management, invasive predators, habitat improvement, will also benefit other threatened species such as Gilbert's potoroo and eastern bristlebird and others which occupy that same habitat there. Okay, so the final 10-year objective is to improve the condition of 20 priority places around the country. These are the priority places on this map here. So it includes 6 islands: Bruny Island, Christmas Island, French Island down in Victoria, Kangaroo Island, Norfolk Island, and Rain Island on the Great Barrier Reef. It includes 1 marine place, which is the giant kelp threatened ecological community, which is a slightly different one in this context. And then it includes 19 mainland places. So this was a new concept for us, these priority places, and each one of them will probably in the end up being tackled and handled differently because their specs are very different. But in order to come up with this list of priority places, and obviously we're spoiled for choice around Australia about how to do this, we again use those prioritisation principles and work with those researchers to run a bit of a structured process to try and do this. So we considered all of the we used all of the IBRA regions, the biogeographical subregions around Australia. For each of those, we considered the density of threatened species and threatened ecological communities. We also considered key biodiversity areas, BirdLife Australia concept that in that space. We considered Ramsar wetlands and other nationally significant wetlands. We looked into land management by First Nations people for conservation outcomes. So that could be co-management, it could have been Indigenous protected areas or other management arrangements. And so we took all of those into account. We also were conscious that threatened ecological communities are listed matters of national environmental significance under the map. They're not included in the 110 species. So we were pretty keen to capture threatened ecological communities through this process as well. Almost all of the places include, there was a couple of exceptions, and I've forgotten off the top, McDonnell Ranges might be one, that don't include threatened ecological communities, but most of them include at least 1 or 2, and some of them include several. So we ran that analysis. We still had a lot of options to choose from. So then we looked to get a spread across land and islands, but also a spread across the different states and the different biomes around Australia. And so I've come up with this final list of 20 places, which we're representing as dots on maps, but I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So I'm not going to go through all 20, but I'm just going to give a quick example of what we're doing and the specs for one of them, which is the Eastern Forests of Far North Queensland priority place. So this is what we think of as one of that sort of larger landscape scale places, as opposed to one of the islands, for example. This priority place supports over 135 threatened species and 6 threatened ecological communities. It's obviously a place of outstanding global importance. It's a World Heritage Area. It's a catchment for the Great Barrier Reef. It's got a couple of Ramsar sites. And so you'll see that the way we've represented this and the other ones when we drill down to them as fuzzy boundaries on this map. And that is because we specifically didn't want to develop polygons where we're going to do this work. These are not regulatory, priority places aren't regulatory in function. So we didn't want to alarm people with lines on maps for very good reason. But we wanted to indicate that these are very important areas for threatened species and biodiversity conservation. We're looking to work in partnership with willing partners to improve the condition of this place with a focus on condition improvement, which can be achieved over the next 5 years. So what that doesn't mean is we're going to address all threats for all species across all land tenures with all partners in that particular priority place. We're going to pick the eyes out of who's interested, what's achievable, and what's going to be most impactful over a 5-year period. And so that's work we have underway right now. So for each of these priority places, we're developing a profile of that place. This work shows some of our initial analysis of the threats that the Far North Queensland priority place faces based on the IUCN threat categories, which was published by Michelle Ward from WWF just a couple of years ago. So you can see that we've highlighted here the particular groups which are most impacted by these threats according to these experts. And these are pretty coarse categories or groupings, but there's lots of detail that underpins each of these. So for issues such as invasive species in this particular priority place, we're probably talking about weeds and pigs in Far North Queensland. For the predators threat there, invasive predators, feral cats are likely to be the main culprit. So what we're going to be doing, we're developing these profiles for all of our places at the moment. That's work that's well underway, but we'll be coupling these profiles with existing work and plans and landscape scale projects, which are also well underway. So in each of these priority places, we're certainly not starting from scratch. The Australian government already has a lot of landscape scale projects underway in these places, but state and local and regional partners have also led lots of work, including very comprehensive planning work for some of these places. So we'll be building in Far North Queensland, building on comprehensive work and planning, which is being led by traditional owners, by natural resource management regions and NGOs. There's private landholders and land managers engaged, the National Environmental Science Program and other researchers, community groups, and of course, local and the Queensland government in this space. So for any of you who've worked up there, you will know that there is a lot going on and there will be a lot of opportunities and there is a lot of interest in working in partnership to improve the condition of this place. Strong First Nations partnerships and opportunities for habitat restoration and connectivity was some of the issues that were raised at one of the recent meetings in Far North Queensland about this place. We expect for these priority places so some of the places it will sort of be obvious what the condition improvement is likely to be. For some of those islands, such as Christmas Island and Kangaroo Island, there will continue to be a focus on eradicating cats over that 5-year period, either island-wide or for certain parts of that island. For some of the mainland places where we will have some options and some actions will be more feasible and more impactful than others. But so for Far North Queensland, you can see from those threats the type of options we're likely to look into, but improvements in fire regimes, habitat improvements, connectivity, and also weed management are likely to be at the front of the pack. Other targets, and I'm not going to go over all of them, there's a lot of them, but other targets relate to management of invasive species, so gamba grass across the northern savannas, cats and foxes, myrtle rust, strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to a changing climate, getting better representation of insurance populations in safe havens, but also in ex situ collections for plants. Targets around participation of First Nations peoples, but also community and private sector in projects. Better preparedness and response for future emergencies like natural disasters, and also improvements in conservation planning, and I've mentioned the monitoring standards already. Next steps in this. Sorry, that first line doesn't quite make sense, but just ignore that. Next steps for us right now, there's lots of next steps and they're sort of mapped out in the action plan. But right now is a critical point in time for us with our program rollout. So we've got the Koala Conservation Program, which is specific to koala, and I won't talk about that in detail today. But the next phase of the Natural Heritage Trust is right now being considered and is to come online in July of next year. The Saving Native Species Program, as I mentioned, some major initiatives are already getting underway and we're designing those programs right now. And we're working very closely with the hubs across the National Environmental Science Program to ensure that this is joined up. This is complemented by those legislative reforms, which are some of them will see the light of day by the end of this year. And I guess all throughout this work, the action plan is a signal of the Australian government's priorities for the next 10 years and a sort of signal to collaborate and an opportunity to collaborate on that. Okay, so I wanted to just go in a slightly different direction just for the end of this talk and to really have just provide a quick overview on evidence-based policy and how to influence government in this regard. And part of this is because I'm continually on a learning journey here. And Giles helped me prepare this bit of the talk. And I thought in the back of my mind, oh, he probably realizes that I don't really feel like I know exactly how this process works. So he's helped to teach me through this. And I must admit, I did learn a bit through reading it. And then I realized, oh, that's exactly how we do our work. I just hadn't never seen it structured like that. So, but I thought I'd also, for this part, just provide a bit of my own background and how I came to this space and why I still consider Australian government sort of both a mysterious beast, but also a wonderful, wonderful place to work. It's sort of constant learnings there. So I am 54, but I didn't join the public service till I was in my 40s. And so I was on a steep learning curve when I arrived there. For my many years in my working life before I joined the Australian Public Service, I worked for large Aboriginal Land Council, the Northern Land Council in the Northern Territory, on caring for country and joint management arrangements. So that was really, really challenging but important and fantastic work experience. That was off the back of prior to that, I was undertaking a postdoc off the back of my PhD, which was in threatened savanna birds and impacts of fire and grazing. So my path to join the Australian Public Service wasn't a traditional one, and I took up my actual driver for taking up a job in Canberra was with the specific intention of influencing the expansion and the long-term commitment to those Indigenous caring for country programs in government. So that was enormously rewarding work. And it was a stepping stone to other equally rewarding work for me in the Australian Public Service. So that was in designing environment programs, leading environmental negotiations internationally. It's quite involved in the wildlife response to the Black Summer bushfires, and then had the opportunity to take up the Threatened Species Commissioner role almost a couple of years back. So in that time, I've worked under different coloured governments and obviously for many different ministers with very different policy agendas and very different operating styles. But government also does work in predictable ways, whether you're on the inside or the outside. And the development of evidence-based policy and communicating with influence is equally important, no matter who you're working to and for. I guess the other thing I would emphasise in this space is the importance of being ready to seize the opportunity, having your ducks lined up for when you may have an opportunity to influence policy or put an idea on the table. Because if you're not ready to spring when that door opens, you may not have that opportunity again for many, many years. So that is, I cannot emphasise that enough. So I guess a quick example of that from my team was we had sort of developed an action plan. New Australian government was elected. There was pretty clear signals around increased ambition around biodiversity conservation without anything clear being on the table. We were very quick to bring into play and to ramp up the ambition of that action plan through various targets. But the one example I've got here is drawing on recent research, which some UQ academics were involved in, and people from my office and others, which on the most imperiled vertebrates, but also other species, to add that to our species list. So it was just useful having that information in the back pocket, and we were ready to roll to do that very quickly. So in summary, good policy and decision making does rely on good advice, even though you may not think that all the time. So there are many passionate and experienced people in the conservation community that actively advocate for their area of expertise, their area of interest. It might be a particular species or a particular threat or region. So whether you're just starting out as an undergrad or actually been engaged in this space for quite some time, there will no doubt be times when you're looking to influence government, and maybe you're looking to do that all the time. So bring it on, the good thing. So I thought I might just leave you here with a few things to think about when delving into the world of government policy from my perspective as a public servant, with an eye to where you might be most influential in that cycle. So for those of you who are interested in this topic, I recommend you head to the Australian Government's Policy Hub website, which has a lot of useful resources. It's linked there. So it's used as a resource by the public service itself, but it's also very useful for people outside the public service who are trying to understand how policy development works and at which point in that cycle you might be influential. In short, good policy advice is clear on intent. So it's focused on the outcome one is trying to achieve. It's well informed, so it's robust and evidence-based. It's practical to implement. So it involves working with those involved in the implementation, trying out multiple pathways to make sure it's going to work, thinking ahead about how it would be evaluated. And it's influential. So the right people have been engaged along the way, and your advice has been tailored to the audience and the context. And it should ideally make decisions easier for the people who are making them. So as part of this, presenting your advice in a way that gets your message across, but is also useful and actionable by those you're engaging with. So that could be public servants like me, ministers, or anyone. And note that what is actionable may actually depend on who you're talking with at that particular time. So it's worth remembering that the Australian public servants exist to serve the government of the day and to assist in developing and delivering its policy agenda and priorities. So where possible, it's not always possible, but where you can, it's very helpful to frame your advice in terms of what the government cares about. So that's key hints are in election commitments, obviously, but also in geopolitical sort of happenings in the budget situation, but also what's happening in the media and community priorities, which are captured there. So key sources of information on this, as I said, are election commitments and consultation processes which are underway. So we've already talked about the OSEM's consultation process, which is happening right now, but also ministerial media statements. They give you an understanding of the culture and the influence and the flavour of things which are really resonating with Australian government members. Key policies in our space right now are obviously the Nature Positive Plan, which we've talked about, and the Threatened Species Action Plan, which has been the focus of this presentation. So in closing, I would like to emphasise that the need for decisive action on the Australian environment has never been greater. We are most certainly at a critical point in time in the recovery of our threatened species and in seriously valuing the environment. This challenge is enormous. It's a long-term endeavour, but the ambition and the opportunity has arguably never been greater. The Australian government has a very important leadership role to play in this space, and Australian government actions and resources arguably need to go further if we're to succeed, but we cannot achieve this alone. So decisive action is needed across governments and indeed across the full range of policy actors, including individuals, whether you're an academic, whether you're an advocate or a passionate individual. We can only hope to recover our threatened species with all hands on deck. Thank you. I have no idea how I did for time. Is there time for questions?
Thank you. Yeah, we did that at time.
I'm sorry.
Let's
Rub it on.